Before the factory, before the assembly line, before steel ruled the world, there was pewter, poured by hand, shaped in silence, carried across an ocean by men who knew that civilization begins not with armies or laws, but with the cups we drink from and the plates we eat off of. Tonight we're stepping into a workshop that hasn't existed for 200 years and listening for what it sounds like. If you're new here, welcome. History for Sleep is your refuge from the noise of the day. Hit subscribe and let the past carry you gently into rest. A new episode drops every week, and your sleep schedule will thank you. Pewter begins, as most quiet things do, with something ordinary. Tin, not gold, not silver, not the dramatic metals that inspire legends and wars. Tin, dull, soft, found in modest quantities in the ground of Cornwall and Bohemia and the mountains of ancient Anatolia, traded along routes that wound through civilizations long before anyone thought to write their names down. Tin had been known to humans for thousands of years before pewter ever existed, and in those early centuries it was prized less for its beauty than for its usefulness. You could work with tin. You could bend it, shape it, melt it over a modest fire, and pour it into a mold and retrieve something solid and functional on the other side. For a species still learning what it meant to make things, that counted for a great deal, but tin alone was never quite enough. Pure tin is too soft for lasting use, too prone to warping and bending under the ordinary pressures of daily life. Leave a pure tin vessel in the cold, a real cold, the kind that settles into a stone house in January, and it begins to degrade, its crystalline structure breaking down in a process metalworkers came to call tin pest, a slow and quiet catastrophe that turns solid metal into gray powder over months and years. The ancients discovered this the hard way, as they discovered most things, through patience and loss, and so began the long human experiment of mixing tin with other metals to make it stronger, more stable, more suited to the world as it actually was. The Romans are often credited with refining early pewter alloys, though the practice of mixing tin with lead almost certainly predates them. Roman excavations across Britain, France, and the Mediterranean have turned up vessels and plates and small household objects that match the composition of what we would recognize today as pewter. Roughly 70 to 90% tin, with lead making up most of the remainder. Lead was abundant, cheap, and well understood. When added to tin in the right proportions, it lowered the melting point of the alloy, making it easier to cast, and it gave the finished metal a satisfying heft, a density that felt substantial in the hand. A Roman drinking vessel made of tin-lead alloy sat on the table without wobbling. It held wine without reacting to it noticeably. It could be dropped and dented without shattering. For a world built on the practical and the portable, this was remarkable. Over the following centuries, as the Roman Empire contracted and medieval Europe slowly rebuilt its craft traditions, pewter became one of the most quietly essential materials in daily life. The medieval pewterers of England and France and the Low Countries developed their alloys with increasing sophistication, learning through generations of trial that small adjustments in composition could produce dramatically different results. More lead made the metal darker and heavier and cheaper, suitable for the rough plates of taverns and monasteries. Less lead, combined with small additions of antimony or bismuth or copper, produced a lighter, brighter alloy that could be polished to a shine approaching silver. By the 14th and 15th centuries, the craft had grown sophisticated enough to demand regulation, and the great pewtering guilds of London and Paris established formal standards, assay requirements, and systems of quality marks that allowed buyers to know exactly what they were purchasing. These touch marks, the small stamps pressed into the underside of finished pewter goods, were the medieval equivalent of a brand name, a guarantee of quality and composition tied to the reputation of a specific craftsman or workshop. The London Pewterers' Company, chartered formally in 1348, required its members to register their marks and submit their alloys for testing. A piece of pewter bearing a legitimate London touch mark was a piece of pewter you could trust. It would not leach alarming quantities of lead into your food. It would not crack at the first hard use. It was made to a standard by someone who had apprenticed for years to understand that standard and who staked his livelihood on maintaining it. In a world without consumer protection laws, without chemistry degrees, without labeling requirements of any kind, the touch mark was a small and humble form of social trust. The agreement between maker and user that the object being exchanged was honestly made. The composition of pewter, even at its most refined, was never fixed to a single formula. Different workshops, different regions, different intended uses, all called for different alloys. What unified them was tin as the base, and the understanding that the additions, lead, antimony, copper, bismuth, each contributed something specific to the character of the finished metal. Lead brought weight and workability but darkened the color, and in high concentrations carried genuine health risks that no one in the medieval or early modern period fully understood. Antimony was harder and brighter, producing an aloe, with a sharper ring and a more mirror-like polish. Copper added strength and a faintly reddish warmth to the surface. Bismuth lowered the melting point further, useful for casting fine detail in smaller objects. A master pewterer understood all of these variables the way a baker understands flour and fat and heat, not through formulas written on paper, but through hands that had handled the material across thousands of hours, through eyes that could read the color of a molten pour and know instantly whether the mix was right. When this craft crossed the Atlantic with the first waves of English colonists, it arrived not as a formal institution, but as embodied knowledge. There were no guilds in the colonies, no Pewter's Company of Boston to regulate marks and alloys, no system of assay and inspection. What arrived instead were the hands and memories of men who had learned the trade in English workshops, men who knew what pewter should feel like when it was right, what it should sound like when you tapped a finished plate with a fingernail and heard that low musical note that meant the alloy had set properly. The crystal structure was sound, the piece would hold. The colonies needed pewter desperately. The households that were being established up and down the Atlantic seaboard, in Massachusetts and Connecticut and Virginia, and later Pennsylvania and the Carolinas, needed plates, cups, spoons, porringers, tankards, candlesticks, inkstands, chamber pots, buttons, buckles, and dozens of other objects that in England would have been pewter as a matter of course. Imported goods from England were expensive, subject to long shipping delays, and increasingly resented as the 17th century gave way to the 18th, and colonial sentiment began to chafe against dependence on the mother country. A craftsman who could make pewter in the colonies was not merely useful. He was, in a quiet and unglamorous way, essential. The raw materials presented a genuine challenge. North America had no significant tin deposits, a lack that would shadow American pewter making throughout the colonial period. Tin had to be imported, either directly from England or through trade networks that wound through the Caribbean and Europe. This made it expensive, and it meant that colonial pewterers were always working with a material that cost real money to obtain, a fact that shaped every aspect of how they ran their workshops. Waste was not merely inefficient, it was economically damaging. Scrap pewter was melted down and reused. Old, worn-out pieces that customers brought in were accepted as payment in kind and returned to the crucible. The colonial pewter workshop operated with a circularity that modern manufacturing has mostly forgotten. The finished object never fully left the system, because when it was no longer serviceable, it became material for the next object. Lead, fortunately, was more readily available in the colonies. Deposits existed in Virginia and elsewhere, and lead was also recovered from old shot, from roof flashing, from the various other uses to which it had been put in the construction and defense of colonial settlements. Antimony could be sourced, though with difficulty. Copper was more reliably obtained. The colonial pewterer was always, to some degree, working with whatever he could get, adjusting his formulas not from a position of ideal supply but from the practical reality of a material world that did not always cooperate. This improvisation, this willingness to work with what was available and adjust accordingly, became one of the defining characteristics of American pewter. It was not always as consistent as its English counterpart. It was not always made to the same standard, but it was made here by hands that understood the trade, for people who needed it. The alloy that most colonial pewterers settled on was broadly similar to what the English Guild called fine metal or trifle, a composition of roughly 90% tin to 10% antimony or lead, sometimes with small copper additions, designed to be bright, relatively hard, and capable of taking a good polish. At this composition, the finished metal had a warm silver-gray color that was unmistakable and to colonial eyes deeply familiar. It sat on the table and caught candlelight, the way silver did, though without silver's cost. It could be buffed on a cloth wheel to a shine. That, in the flickering light of a colonial interior, was genuinely beautiful, the phrase that attached itself to pewter in this period, the poor man's silver, was not only a statement about economics, it was a statement about aspiration, about the human desire to surround oneself with objects that reflected a certain dignity, a certain care, even when the means to achieve that dignity were modest. Pewter in early America was not a status symbol exactly, but neither was it purely utilitarian. The families that set their tables with pewter plates and pewter tankards were not wealthy by the standards of the time. The wealthy had silver, real silver wrought by goldsmiths and silversmiths, whose work constituted a genuine investment as well as a display. What pewter offered was the form of that dignity without the price. A well-made pewter plate had weight and presence, and a surface that gleamed when polished. It required care, regular buffing with fine sand or leather to maintain its luster, prompt attention to dents and damage, and that care was itself a form of relationship with the object. Colonial housewives polished their pewter the way their grandchildren would polish silverware, with a sense that the object merited the attention, that its surface was worth preserving. This relationship between user and object was enforced by economics in a way we have largely lost touch with. In a colonial household, nothing of value was casually discarded. A pewter plate that had been dropped and bent was taken to the pewterer to be repaired or remade. A candlestick that had cracked was returned to the crucible. The life of any given piece of pewter might extend across decades, through multiple owners and multiple remakings, its metal passing in and out of different forms as the years accumulated. A spoon might become a plate, might become a tankard, might become, at the end of its long life, a button. The tin and antimony in it never went away. They simply changed shape according to need, presided over by craftsmen who understood that the material itself was the value and the form was just the material's current assignment. It graced tables from Boston to Charleston. That much is historically verifiable in the inventories and account books and probate records that have survived. When colonial families died and their estates were settled, the pewter was listed, item by item, with its weight recorded. Because the weight determined its value as raw material, if nothing else, these inventories read today like quiet poems of domestic life. 1 dozen pewter plates, 4 pewter porringers, 1 pewter tankard, 3 pewter spoons, 1 pewter basin. The list goes on, and behind each item is a meal, a hand, a life, conducted in the ordinary rhythms of eating and drinking, and the long dailiness of being human. Pewter was the material of that dailiness, present at every table, handled every day, washed and dried and stacked and used again, until it wore out and was remade. What it was exactly was always several things at once. It was a technical achievement, a specific and carefully considered combination of metals whose properties had been understood through centuries of accumulated craft knowledge. It was an economic solution, the answer to the problem of how to furnish a household with dignity when silver was beyond reach and wood or clay felt insufficient to the occasion. It was a social object, something that appeared on tables across the entire range of colonial society, except its very wealthiest tier, common enough to be familiar and fine enough to be valued, and it was a kind of quiet mirror of the world that made it. Practical, unpretentious, shaped by the materials available and the knowledge at hand, designed not for permanence in the precious object sense, but for the longer, slower permanence of the useful and the well-made. The metal itself, held in the hand, is still surprising to those who encounter it for the first time in a museum collection. It is heavier than it looks. It has warmth, not the cold flash of silver, but something more muted, more gentle. The surface, where it has been polished, holds light in a way that seems almost reluctant, as though the metal is considering how much to give back. Run a finger along the rim of a Colonial pewter plate, and you feel the slight irregularities of hand burnishing, the evidence of hours of patient work. It was made by someone who knew what they were doing. It was made to be used. And in the quiet simplicity of those two facts, the knowledge and the purpose, you can find almost everything worth knowing about the world that produced it. There is a particular kind of knowledge that cannot be written down, not because the words do not exist, but because the writing of it would be its undoing. The recipes that English pewters carried in their heads across the Atlantic were that kind of knowledge. They were not secrets in the dramatic sense, not locked in strong boxes or whispered under oath in candlelit rooms, though somehow that ceremony did exist. They were secrets in the deeper, quieter sense, knowledge so bound to the body, so embedded in years of repetitive practice, that it could not be fully separated from the person who held it. A formula written on paper is information. A formula lived through 10,000 pourings, adjusted by feel and smell and sound, and the particular color of molten metal in a specific kind of light. That is something else entirely. That is craft. And craft, when it crossed the ocean, crossed not as text, but as flesh. To understand what the pewters carried with them, it helps to understand what they were leaving behind. The London Pewterers' Company was one of the oldest and most established of the great livery companies that organized skilled trades in medieval and early modern England. Its formal charter dated to 1348, though the trade it governed was considerably older than that, reaching back through centuries of European metalworking tradition to the Roman workshops that had first refined the tin-lead alloys from which pewter descended. By the time the company received its royal charter from Edward III, it was already a mature institution, with customs and hierarchies and systems of accountability that had developed organically over generations. The charter simply formalized what the trade had already become: a closed, self-regulating community of craftsmen, bound together by shared knowledge, mutual obligation, and the collective interest in maintaining the value of what they made. The structure of the guild was the structure of knowledge itself. At the bottom were the apprentices, boys taken on at 12 or 14, bound by indenture to a master for 7 years. Their labor exchanged for instruction in the mysteries of the trade. The word mysteries was not metaphorical. It appeared in guild documents and apprenticeship contracts with genuine in denoting the specialized knowledge of a craft that was in the fullest sense not publicly available. An apprentice who completed his term and was admitted as a journeyman had access to that knowledge. A layman who had not served his time did not, and the guild worked actively to ensure that distinction held. The penalties for revealing guild secrets to outsiders were real and enforced. Fines, expulsion from the company, in some periods the legal destruction of a craftsman's tools, and the prohibition of his practice. The secrets themselves were, in their technical content, primarily about alloy composition. The Pewter's Company recognized and regulated several distinct grades of pewter, each with its own formula and its own approved uses. At the top of the hierarchy was what the guild called fine metal, an alloy of tin and antimony, sometimes with small copper additions, designed to produce the brightest, hardest, most silver-like surface possible. This was the grade used for display pieces, for the fine plates and flagons and communion cups that would be seen and handled by people of quality. Below it was trifle, a slightly different composition suitable for the broader market of middling households. Below that were the lesser grades, increasingly lead-heavy, increasingly dark, suitable for tavern use and rough service where appearance mattered less than durability and cost. Each of these grades had its specific proportions, and those proportions were not published or freely shared. They were taught, slowly and deliberately, through the apprenticeship system, revealed to the learner not all at once but incrementally, as trust was established and competence demonstrated. A new apprentice spent his first years doing the labor that required no knowledge of formulas: cleaning and preparing molds, tending fires, buffing and polishing finished pieces, running errands, watching everything. The watching was essential. Before a young craftsman was ever told anything explicitly, he was expected to observe, to build up, through sustained attention, a working model of what was happening in the workshop and why. By the time the master began to explain, the apprentice already knew more than he realized. and the explanation was less a revelation than a confirmation of what careful watching had already suggested. This pedagogy was not unique to pewtering. It was the fundamental method of craft transmission in pre-industrial Europe, common across every skilled trade from weaving to surgery. But it had particular significance in pewter, because the critical variables in the craft were so difficult to specify in language and so readily communicated through demonstration. How do you describe in words the exact moment when a molten alloy is ready to pour, when it has reached the precise temperature at which it will flow cleanly into the mold without cooling too fast or retaining too much heat? You can say, watch the surface. When the slight shimmering that indicates turbulent convection settles into a still, mirror-like calm, and the color shifts from the bright orange-yellow of excess heat to the quieter, more silver-toned glow of the right temperature. Then it is ready. But reading those instructions is not the same as standing beside a crucible with a master pewterer who taps your arm at exactly the right moment and says, simply, now. The now is the knowledge. Everything else is commentary. The Guild's regulation of this knowledge extended beyond the apprenticeship system into the broader commercial life of the trade. The touch mark system, the requirement that every piece of pewter bear the registered mark of its maker, was not only a quality guarantee for consumers, it was a surveillance mechanism. A piece of pewter bearing a SAS, UG standard alloy, or a fraudulent composition misrepresented as a higher grade, could be traced back to its maker through his mark. The company maintained records of all registered marks and conducted periodic searches of workshops and market stalls, seizing and destroying pieces that failed to meet the required standard. These searches were not gentle. Guild searchers had legal authority to enter premises, to confiscate goods, to levy fines. A pewterer caught adulterating his alloy, adding too much lead to fine metal grade to cut costs, for example, faced consequences severe enough to end his livelihood. This enforcement created an atmosphere that was, depending on your position within it, either reassuringly orderly or suffocatingly restrictive. For the established masters, Guild regulation was largely beneficial. It prevented competition from being driven entirely by price, which would have pressured everyone toward cheaper, lower-quality alloys. It maintained the reputation of English pewter as a trustworthy product, which supported export markets and justified higher prices than unregulated goods could command. For the journeymen and the craftsmen who had served their time but lacked the capital to set up their own shops, the Guild's restrictions on who could practice the trade and where could feel like a ceiling rather than a floor, a structure that protected the established at the expense of the aspiring. It was from this second group largely that the emigrant craftsmen came. The men who left England for the colonies in the 17th and 18th centuries were not typically the comfortable masters of established London workshops. They were men in motion, craftsmen who had completed their training but found their advancement blocked, either by lack of capital, by the saturation of local markets, by family circumstances, or by the simple human desire to, try somewhere new. They were journeymen who had spent years working for other men's profits and wanted, finally, to work for their own. They were craftsmen from the provincial towns of England, from Bristol and York, and Exeter and Norwich, where guild structures existed but were looser, less rigorously enforced than in London, where the trade had a different character, and the possibilities felt both wider and more uncertain. What all of them carried was the accumulated knowledge of their apprenticeships. Not written down, there was no need to write it down, because it was already stored in a more reliable medium than paper. It was stored in their hands and their eyes, in the particular sensitivity of their noses to the smell of a correctly heated alloy, versus one that had oxidized slightly and would need to be skimmed before pouring. It was stored in the muscle memory of burnishing a curved surface to uniform smoothness, of applying exactly the right pressure to the finishing tool to remove a seam without thinning the metal beneath it. It was stored in the knowledge of how to set up a workshop, what equipment was essential, what could be improvised, what the workflow of a productive day actually looked like from the first lighting of the furnace to the final tally of finished goods. When these men arrived in the colonies, they arrived into an absence that was, in its way, an extraordinary freedom. There was no Pewterers' Company of Boston. There was no guild authority to register marks with, no searchers with legal power to enter a workshop and confiscate substandard goods, no 7-year indenture system enforced by contract and custom and the weight of centuries, the knowledge they had worked so hard to acquire. The formulas and techniques that in England belonged in some sense to the guild as much as to them were now entirely their own. They could use them a set they saw fit. They could adapt them, experiment with them, share them, or withhold them according to their own judgment. The guild's secrets had become, in the New World, simply their knowledge, personal, portable, and free. This freedom had immediate practical consequences. Without guild-regulated grades, the colonial pewterer could adjust his alloys to suit the materials available to him, which were not always the same as those available in England. Tin had to be imported and was expensive. Lead was more readily available. Antimony could be sourced, but sometimes with difficulty. A colonial craftsman working with the genuine knowledge of how his alloys behaved could make intelligent substitutions and adjustments that an English journeyman, constrained by guild standards, could not have made without risking prosecution. He could, for example, use a slightly higher lead content in everyday plateware, more than the guild's fine metal standard allowed, because he knew from experience that at a certain composition the metal remained serviceable. But tangent serviceable, the health risks were not dramatically increased over what his customers were already exposed to through their cooking vessels and water pipes, and the cost savings allowed him to price his goods within reach of the colonial market he was trying to serve. Without the touch mark system's surveillance function, colonial marks served a different social purpose. They were not guild-verified quality certifications. They were signatures, statements of identity and pride from craftsmen who had no regulatory body demanding their registration, but who understood, from their English training, that marking one's work was part of what it meant to be a craftsman. The marks that colonial pewterers pressed into their work, the small stamps bearing initials or names, or simple symbols that collectors still search for today on the undersides of surviving pieces, were voluntary declarations. They said, "I made this, I stand behind it, not because the guild compels me, but because I choose to." This shift from compelled accountability to voluntary accountability is not a trivial thing. In England, a pewterer marked his work partly because he had to, and the mark carried the guild's authority as much as his own. In the colonies, a pewterer marked his work because he chose to, and the mark carried only his own reputation, which was, in the small, interconnected communities of colonial America, perhaps an even more effective quality guarantee. A Boston craftsman whose pewter failed, whose plates cracked, or whose alloys turned out too soft or too dark, faced a community of customers who knew him, who talked to one another, who would remember and would not come back. The guild's elaborate enforcement machinery was replaced by the simpler, more direct mechanism of social trust in a face-to-face world. The formulas that arrived in colonial workshops were refined and adapted over the generations that followed. The sons and apprentices of the first emigrant pewterers learned the trade in a specifically American context, without the guild's framework, without the formal grades and their regulatory meanings, but with the same fundamental understanding of how tin and its associated metals behaved under heat, under pressure, over time. American pewter developed its own character through this process, somewhat more varied in composition than its English counterpart, somewhat less consistent across workshops, but in its best examples fully equal in quality to anything being made in England, and often better suited to the practical needs of the market it served. The knowledge had crossed the ocean in human memory, and in human memory it continued to evolve. Each craftsman who trained an apprentice was, in a sense, perform engine act of translation, taking what he knew and finding ways to transmit it to someone who did not yet know it. This transmission was never perfect. Things were lost at each crossing. Things were also added, local adaptations. Clever improvisations, solutions to problems that the original English training had not anticipated because those problems only existed in America, with its different climate, its different available materials, its different customers with their different needs and expectations. What the guild had tried to protect through its elaborate machinery of secrets and enforcement was, In the end, a body of craft knowledge that survived the dismantling of those protections remarkably well. The knowledge was robust because it was not primarily propositional. It was not a set of facts that could be stolen or leaked, or forgotten in the way that a formula written on paper might be. It was practical, procedural, embodied, the kind of knowledge that requires a human life to carry it, and a human relationship to transmit it. The Guild understood this at some level, which is why it organized the transmission of craft knowledge through the intimate, prolonged relationship of master and apprentice rather than through manuals or written curricula. The apprenticeship system was not just a labor arrangement. It was a technology for the preservation and transfer of embodied knowledge across generations. When that system crossed the Atlantic without the guild structure that had surrounded it, what survived was not the institution, but the core technology. The relationship between an experienced craftsman and a learner, the slow, patient transfer of knowledge through demonstration and practice and the particular kind of attention that close physical work demands. Colonial pewter workshops may have lacked the formal apparatus of the London Pewterers' Company, but you had masters who had learned from masters, who had learned from masters before them, in an unbroken chain of transmission that reached back through the guild centuries to the Roman workshops where the first consistent pewter alloys had been developed in the firelight of another world entirely. The secrets traveled, as secrets of the body always do, inside people, and when those people arrived in a new land and set up their furnaces and opened their molds, and felt the familiar weight of well-made pewter cooling in their hands, the knowledge was still there, unchanged and unchangeable, because it had never been anywhere but inside them. There is a moment, in the middle of a working day in a pewter workshop, when everything goes quiet. The furnace has been stoked and left to hold its heat. The alloy in the crucible has been brought to temperature and skimmed, and is now simply waiting, still and silver bright, for the pour. The mold has been prepared, warmed, lightly smoked over a candle to prevent the metal from sticking to its surface, set on the bench at the precise angle that years of practice have determined is correct for this particular form. The craftsman stands with the crucible handle in both hands, feeling its weight shift as the liquid metal moves inside it, and for a moment he is simply still. The workshop is simply still. Outside, the ordinary sounds of a colonial town continue. A cart on cobblestones, a dog, the distant calling of someone's name across a yard. But inside, in the particular atmosphere that a pewter workshop generates around itself like a kind of weather, there is quiet. And then the pour begins. The sound of molten pewter entering a mold is unlike almost any other sound in the world of making. It is not the dramatic crash and hiss of iron being quenched in water, not the ringing percussion of a hammer on an anvil, not the high whine of a saw or the rhythmic thud of a loom. It is quieter than all of these, and more intimate, a soft, rushing whisper as the metal finds its way into the channels of the mold, followed by a brief, encumbered its way into the channels of the mold, followed by a brief, barely audible settling sound as the alloy reaches the furthest corners of the form and stops moving. Then silence again, broken only by the faintest of sounds, a delicate ticking, almost inaudible, as the metal begins to cool and contract microscopically against the walls of the mold. If you were standing in that workshop and did not know what you were listening to, you might not notice the sound at all. You might simply feel it, a subtle presence in the air, the acoustic equivalent of watching something breathe. This is worth dwelling on, because it is so entirely contrary to the mental image most people carry of early metalworking. We have been shaped by centuries of iconography, the forge, the anvil, the muscular smith with his hammer raised, sparks flying in dramatic arcs against a backdrop of firelight and shadow. That image is real and accurate for its own trade. Blacksmithing is a loud art. The iron that a blacksmith works must be struck repeatedly, rhythmically, with force sufficient to move metal that resists movement, and the sound of that striking, that clear, bright, carrying ring of hammer on hot iron, is one of the defining sounds of pre-industrial human civilization. You could hear a blacksmith's shop from a considerable distance. The sound announced the trade before anything else did. A pewter workshop announced itself differently, or barely at all. Walk past one on a colonial street and what you might notice first was not sound but smell, the particular metallic warmth of a tin alloy being held at working temperature, a clean, faintly mineral scent that was not unpleasant and was entirely distinct from the more acrid, smoky smell of a forge. If you stopped and listened at the door, what you heard depended on which stage of the work was in progress. During the pour, near silence. During the cooling, near silence. During the unmolding, the careful opening of the mold and the first view of the rough casting inside. A quiet series of sounds. The wooden or metal pins that held the mold halves together being removed one by one, the slow creak of the mold opening, the slow creak of the mold opening, the small sound of the casting being lifted free, and then for the long middle hours of the working day, the sound that defined the workshop more than any other, the scrape. Pewter castings do not emerge from the mold finished. What comes out is recognizable as the intended form, a plate, a spoon, a tankard body, but it is rough at the seams where the two halves of the mold met, and its surface carries the texture of the mold itself, whether that mold was cut from soapstone or brass or gunmetal, or the harder alloys that the more prosperous workshops favored. Before a casting could be sold, before it could even be considered complete, it had to be worked. The seams had to be removed, the surface had to be refined, the form had to be trued, brought into the precise roundness or flatness or curvature that the finished object required. All of this work was done by hand, with steel tools of various kinds, and the sound it made was the sound of steel moving steadily and deliberately across soft metal. Soapstone, the material most commonly used for molds in the colonial period, was chosen partly for its acoustic implications, though no pewterer would have described it in those terms. It was chosen because it was relatively easy to carve, could withstand the repeated thermal cycling of being filled with hot metal and then cooling, and released castings cleanly without requiring complex release agents. But soapstone molds also produced castings with a particular set texture, slightly soft, slightly granular, that responded beautifully to the steel scraper. The scraper, a simple tool with a hardened blade held at a precise angle to the work, could remove the surface of a soapstone cast piece to a depth of a fraction of a millimeter, and reveal beneath it a denser, more uniform metal that took a polish with extraordinary willingness. The scraping was done on a lathe for circular objects, plates, bowls, the bodies of tankards, and by hand for more complex forms. The lathe used in a pewter workshop was not the powered machinery of a later age. It was a simple device, often foot-powered through a treadle and flywheel arrangement, that rotated the workpiece at a steady speed while the craftsman held his scraping tool against it with both hands. The tool had to be held at exactly the right angle, not so steep that it dug into the metal and created chatter marks, not so shallow that it merely polished without cutting. Finding that angle was one of the first things an apprentice had to learn, and it was learned not from instruction but from feel. The particular resistance in the hands when the angle was right, the way the metal curled away from the tool in thin, bright ribbons that caught the light as they fell, the sound, that distinctive sustained even scrape, that told you the cut was clean. That sound is the heartbeat of the pewter workshop. It is not loud, but it carries a peculiar quality of steadiness, of purposeful repetition that makes it oddly restful to be near. Unlike the blacksmith's hammer, which strikes and lifts and strikes again in a rhythm that is always slightly variable, always slightly unpredictable, the pewter scraper moves in long continuous sweeps. A sound that begins and sustains and ends and begins again with the regularity of breathing or of water moving over stone. Workers in other trades had the battered, I've been asked, might have found a pewter workshop unnervingly quiet. To the pewter himself, that sustained scraping was simply the sound of work going well, the audio equivalent of a line drawn straight, a surface coming true, a form revealing itself from the rough casting the way a figure might be said to emerge from stone. The molds themselves contributed to the workshop's acoustic character. Soapstone, being a relatively soft and dense material, absorbed sound rather than reflecting it, giving the workshop interior a quality of dampness, not literal dampness, but acoustic dampness. The sense that sounds stopped a little sooner than expected, that the room held them briefly and let them go. Brass molds, used for finer work and by more prosperous workshops, had a harder acoustic signature. The sound of metal being unmolded from brass was crisper, more defined, but even with brass molds, the fundamental character of the work was the same: quiet, deliberate, sustained. The mallet that pewterers used appeared in the work less often than a visitor might expect. It was used primarily for raising and forming, for the technique by which a flat sheet of pewter was worked over a form to produce a curved surface, struck repeatedly with a wooden or rawhide mallet that left no marks on the soft metal. This technique, used to make the more complex curved forms that could not be easily cast, the sweeping sides of certain flagons, the rounded covers of tankards, the particular profiles of some colonial period porringers, produced a sound that was distinctive without being loud. A series of soft, rounded impacts, each one slightly different in pitch depending on where it landed and how the metal had changed shape beneath it, building over time into a kind of irregular music. Not a rhythm exactly, but a pattern. The craftsman moving around the form methodically, striking each area in sequence, returning to areas that needed more work, his ear as much as his eye telling him when the form had reached the correct shape. The fire, throughout all of this, maintained its own sound in the background. The small charcoal furnaces used in pewter workshops, much more modest than the great blast furnaces of the ironworking trade, burned with a relatively contained sound, a low, steady combustion that was present but not intrusive, a kind of bass note against which the higher frequencies of the work were laid. The bellows, used periodically to encourage the fire when the temperature of the crucible needed to be raised, produced a more assertive sound. The rhythmic exhale of compressed air, the corresponding flare of the flame. But even this was brief and purposeful, an interruption rather than a constant. Colonial pewter workshops were almost always small, intimate spaces. Unlike the large communal workshops of some other trades, pewter shops typically employed a master and one or two apprentices, occasionally a journeyman or two in the more productive establishments. This scale was partly economic. The trade did not require large numbers of hands in the way that some textile or construction work did, and partly practical, since the workflow of pewter making did not lend itself to large-scale division of labor in the pre-industrial period. But it also meant that the workshop was a quiet place in a social sense, as well as an acoustic one. The people in it were few. They were engaged in work that required concentration, and the kind of constant sociable chatter that might accompany more physically automatic work was less present. There was talk, certainly. The workshop was not a place of enforced silence, but the talk was functional, punctuated by long intervals of quiet industry, shaped by the rhythm of the work itself. This quality of concentrated quiet had effects on everyone who spent time in it. Apprentices who had come from louder trades, boys who had briefly tried a blacksmith shop or a couage or a tanner's yard before finding their way into a pewter workshop, often commented, or at least the historical record suggests they might have commented, on the difference in atmosphere. The pewter workshop was a place where you could hear yourself think, where the work, demanding as it was, allowed a certain interior space that louder trades did not. The scraping and the burnishing and the slow rotation of the lathe created a soundscape that was active without being assaulting, that occupied the surface of attention without consuming all of it, leaving room for whatever thoughts arrived and departed in the long hours between morning and evening. Burnishing, which followed scraping in the sequence of finishing operations, produced yet another layer of the workshop's acoustic character. The burnishing tool, a hard, polished steel or agate implement pressed firmly against the pewter surface and moved in overlapping strokes, made almost no sound at all. It was the quietest operation in the entire process, a near silence during which the surface of the metal was being transformed at a level below what the ear could easily detect. The craftsman working a burnisher across a plate felt the work more than he heard it. The slight drag of the tool on the metal, the gradual change in that drag as the surface became more uniform and more polished, the moment when the resistance shifted and the tool began to slide with a smoothness that indicated the surface was ready. In that mere silence, the burnisher moving in its steady overlapping strokes, the pewter plate slowly revealing its fullest brightness, The workshop achieved its deepest quiet. There is something about this quality of sustained, purposeful quiet that the modern world has largely lost access to. We have silence, or something we call silence. The silence of a room with no people in it, of a countryside without traffic, of a pair of noise-canceling headphones in a loud environment. But the silence of a working pewter workshop was a different thing. It was a silence that was full rather than empty, full of the small sounds of making, of material being transformed by patient human attention, of tools moving with accumulated skill over surfaces that were slowly becoming what they were meant to be. It was a silence that had purpose embedded in it, that was productive in the deepest sense of that word, that was generating objects of genuine use and moderate beauty while maintaining the quality of a space in which the mind could rest. The hours of a working day in such a place must have had a texture unlike almost anything available to us now. The light, coming through small windows and from the glow of the furnace, was warm and variable. The temperature, regulated by the fire to the needs of the metal rather than the comfort of the workers, was probably higher than we would choose today. The smells, metal, charcoal, the faint waxy scent of the smoked molds, the occasional sharper note of an alloy being skimmed, were specific and constant, and over all of it, that soundscape, the soft hiss of a pour, the patient scraping, the quiet rotation of the lathe, the almost inaudible ticking of cooling metal in a mold, the deep background breath of the fire, a rhythm composed not of drum beats but of process, not of music but of making, regular enough to be restful, varied enough to be alive, quiet enough to let everything else in the mind settle slowly toward the floor. We were not designed for the noise of the world we have built, something in the human nervous system, shaped over hundreds of thousands of years in environments where most sounds were either natural or the quiet sounds of human hands at work, responds to that older acoustic register with something very close to relief. The pewter workshop was loud by the standards of a forest or a sleeping house, but by the standards of nearly everything that came after it, it was quiet, profoundly, usefully, restoratively quiet. A place where the work was the sound and the sound was the work, and both of them together formed something that the body recognized, even if the mind could not name what it was recognized. Designed almost for sleep, there is a particular kind of ending that does not announce itself. It does not arrive with the drama of a fire, or a flood, or a war, does not produce ruins that future generations can photograph and mourn. It arrives instead as a series of small, reasonable decisions made by ordinary people responding to ordinary circumstances. A craftsman who cannot quite compete with the new prices. A customer who chooses the shinier object on the shelf. A young man who looks at his father's workshop and decides, not unkindly, that his future lies elsewhere. These decisions accumulate over years and decades until one day the workshop is empty, the tools are sold or rusting. The tools are sold or rusting, and the knowledge that animated the whole enterprise has retreated to the last few people who carry it. Aging now, with no apprentices waiting to receive what they know, this is how most things end. Not with a declaration but with a drift, and this is precisely how American pewter ended. Drifting out of the world so gradually that almost no one noticed it going, until it was nearly gone. To understand the fall, you have to first understand how complete the rise had been. By the final decades of the 18th century, pewter was woven into the fabric of American daily life, with an intimacy that is difficult to fully appreciate from our current distance. It was not merely common, it was ubiquitous in the way that certain materials become ubiquitous when they are exactly right for the conditions that produce them, when they are cheap enough to be widely accessible, durable enough to justify the purchase, and familiar enough that no one questions their presence. Pewter plates sat on tables in farmhouses in Connecticut and counting houses in Philadelphia and taverns in Virginia. Pewter tankards held the cider and ale that colonists drank in quantities that would alarm a modern physician. Pewter spoons were the utensils most commonly listed in household inventories across every colony, from the grandest establishments to the most modest. Pewter porringers, those shallow, handled bowls used for everything from porridge to medicine to the washing of infants, appeared in probate records so frequently that their absence from a household inventory was more remarkable than their presence. The craftsmen who supplied all of this were distributed across the colonial and early Republican landscape in a pattern that followed population and commerce. The great centers were in New England, Boston, Hartford, and especially the Connecticut River Valley towns, where a concentration of pewtering families produced work of remarkable quality and variety across multiple generations. New York had its own strong tradition, fed by both English immigrant craftsmen and the Dutch metalworking culture that had preceded English dominance in the region. Philadelphia, as the largest and most commercially sophisticated city in late colonial America, supported a thriving trade. Baltimore, Charleston, and the smaller towns of the middle and southern colonies had their own pewterers, though in smaller numbers and with less documentation surviving to tell their stories. These craftsmen were not wealthy men, as a rule. They occupied the solid middle ground of colonial and early Republican society. Skilled artisans who owned their tools and their workshops, who employed apprentices and sometimes journeymen, who paid their taxes and served on committees, and were known in their communities as reliable makers of necessary things. Their prosperity rose and fell with the broader economy, suffered during the disruptions of the Revolution when tin imports were interrupted, and the ordinary business of peacetime commerce was suspended and recovered afterward as the new nation settled into its economic life, and the demand for household goods reasserted itself with the quiet insistence of daily need. The Revolution itself had, briefly and paradoxically, given American pewter a kind of patriotic significance it had not previously possessed. The non-importation movements of the 1760s and 1770s, which encouraged colonists to refuse British manufactured goods as a form of political resistance, made domestically produced pewter not merely useful, but virtuous. To set your table with American-made pewter, rather than imported English ware, was a small, daily act of political commitment, a statement made with every meal about where your loyalties lay and what kind of future you were willing to work toward. Some pewterers of the period understood this and marketed their work accordingly, emphasizing its American origins in a commercial environment where such origins had suddenly become a selling point. But political sentiment is a fragile foundation for any craft tradition, and as the Revolution receded into memory and the new nation's commercial life normalized, the patriotic premium on American-made goods faded. What remained was the straightforward economic reality of a competitive market, and in that market, American pewter faced challenges that would ultimately prove insurmountable. The first and most immediately consequential of these challenges had a name: Britannia metal. Britannia metal was not, in its basic composition, dramatically different from the pewter it would eventually displace. It was still a tin-based alloy, still belonging to the broad family of materials that pewterers had been working with for centuries. What made it different was the specific combination of tin with antimony and copper in proportions that had been refined by the English manufacturers who developed it in the late 18th century to produce a metal that was measurably harder, more resistant to surface scratching, and capable of being worked in ways that traditional pewter could not easily accommodate. Britannia metal could be rolled into thin sheets and then stamped, spun, or pressed into forms using mechanized equipment. It could be produced in large quantities with consistent quality that the hand-casting methods of traditional pewter workshops found difficult to match, and when it was polished, it achieved a brightness and whiteness that surpassed traditional pewter. Closer to silver in appearance, more immediately impressive to a customer comparing the two on a shop shelf. The timing of Britannia metal's arrival in American markets was significant. The 1820s and 1830s were a period of rapid commercial and technological change in the young republic, a period when the idea of improvement, of doing things faster, better, more efficiently, with greater consistency and at lower cost, had acquired an almost moral urgency in the culture. The craftsman working slowly and individually at his bench, producing objects one at a time through the application of accumulated personal skill, was not yet a figure of nostalgia. He was simply a figure of the past, or beginning to be, in a world that was orienting itself decisively toward the future. And the future, it seemed clear to almost everyone who thought about it, belonged to the machine. American manufacturers who adopted Britannia metal and the mechanized production methods it accommodated could offer household goods at prices that individual pewterers, working by hand with expensive imported tin, could not approach. A spinning lathe which pressed a flat disc of Britannia metal against a rotating wooden form and shaped it into a teapot body or a pitcher in a fraction of the time required to cast and finish a comparable piece in traditional pewter. Piece in traditional pewter changed the economics of the trade entirely. One worker operating a spinning lathe could produce in a day what a skilled handcaster might produce in a week. The arithmetic was simple and devastating. Customers who had been purchasing pewter from local craftsmen for generations found that they could now buy Britannia metal goods of equal or superior surface appearance from merchants who stocked machine-made wares at prices that made the handcrafted alternative seem not merely old-fashioned, but almost irrationally expensive. The established pewterers of the 1820s and 1830s responded to this challenge in various ways. Some attempted to adopt the new methods themselves, investing in spinning equipment and shifting their production toward Britannia metal. A few succeeded in making this transition. The Meriden Britannia Company, which would eventually become part of International Silver, had its origins in precisely this kind of adaptive response by craftsmen who understood that survival required transformation. But for most individual workshop owners, the capital investment required to mechanize was simply beyond reach. They had built their livelihoods around a particular set of skills, tools, and methods, and those livelihoods could not be easily converted into something different. They continued making traditional pewter for as long as a market for it existed, watched that market contract year by year, and eventually, each in his own time and his own way, stopped. The contraction was not only a matter of competition from Britannia metal, it was also a matter of changing taste. And taste is in some ways a more implacable force than economics because it operates below the level of conscious decision. The aesthetic preferences of American consumers in the mid-19th century were moving steadily away from the quiet, warm, slightly matte beauty of traditional pewter and toward surfaces that were bright, more assertively shiny, more visually demanding. Silver-plated wares, made possible by the development of electroplating technology in the 1840s, offered the appearance of genuine silver at a fraction of the cost, not the appearance of pewter polished to its best, but actual silver deposited on a base metal surface through an electrical process that produced a result indistinguishable to the casual eye from the solid article. Against this, pewter's modest gleam could not compete on aesthetic grounds, any more than it could compete on economic grounds against machine-made Britannia ware. Tin plate, sheet iron coated with a thin layer of tin, delivered another blow from a different direction. For the utilitarian end of the market that pewter had long served, tin plate was cheaper, lighter, and sufficiently durable for most everyday purposes. Tin plate cups and plates and pails flooded the market in the middle decades of the 19th century, produced in factories that could turn out thousands of identical objects in the time it took a pewterer to complete a dozen. The tin peddlers who traveled rural route, with their wagons loaded with tin plate goods, became a characteristic figure of mid-19th century American life. Familiar, welcome, carrying the convenience of the industrial age directly to households that might not otherwise have easy access to town markets. What they were also carrying, though no one thought of it in those terms, was the displacement of the last significant market for handmade pewter goods. The craftsmen who lived through this transition occupied a peculiarly melancholy position, though the historical record rarely shows them describing it in those terms. They were practical people, accustomed to adapting to market conditions and the language of craft romanticism, the idea that the handmade object possessed a spiritual value that a machine-made object lacked. An idea that would become central to the arts and crafts movement later in the century was not yet widely available to them as a way of understanding their situation. They knew that their trade was declining. They could see it in their order books, feel it in the increasing difficulty of finding apprentices willing to invest years of their youth in learning a craft whose economic future was uncertain. But the frameworks for dignifying that decline, for asserting the value of what was being lost against the evident efficiency of what was replacing it, had not yet fully developed. What was being lost was, in retrospect, considerable. The knowledge that had traveled from English guild workshops to colonial America, that had adapted itself to the conditions of a new world, and produced across 2 centuries a distinctive tradition of American making. That knowledge was dissolving back into the individuals who held it. And those individuals were aging, and their apprentices were fewer with each passing decade, and the chain of transmission that had connected Roman metalworkers to medieval guild craftsmen to colonial American pewterers was fraying link by link in the workshops of the mid-19th century. By the time the Civil War ended and the industrialized production of household goods had fully consolidated its dominance, traditional American pewter making was not quite dead, but it was reduced to something so marginal, a few elderly craftsmen in a few places, maintaining a practice that had lost its commercial rationale. That dead was perhaps not a meaningfully different description. The objects survived in greater numbers than the knowledge that made them. Pewter, being a metal, resisted the ordinary entropy of time better than wood or textile or paper. Pieces that had been made in the workshops of 18th century Connecticut or New York sat in attics and cellars through the decades of the craft's decline, neither valued enough to be prominently displayed nor worthless enough to be discarded. They accumulated the minor damages of long storage, dents, surface oxidation, the dark patina that pewter develops when it is left unpolished for years, and waited with the patient indifference of all inanimate objects to be rediscovered. That rediscovery would come, eventually, through the twin mechanisms of antique collecting and museum acquisition that would give American pewter a second life as an object of historical significance and aesthetic appreciation. But that life was a different kind of life from the one the objects had originally been made for. A pewter plate in a museum vitrine is not the same thing as a pewter plate on a colonial table. It has been removed from the circuit of use that gave it meaning, preserved against the very processes, handling, washing, polishing, the ordinary wear of daily life, that constituted its original existence. It is the same object, and a fundamentally different one, and the distance between those two versions of itself is the distance between a living craft tradition and a historical artifact. That distance, measured in years, was crossed in less than half a century. The craft that had seemed as permanent as daily life itself in 1790 was functionally extinct by 1860. Not because it failed on its own terms. The pewter that American craftsmen made at their best was as good as anything being made anywhere in the world, but because the world changed around it faster than it could adapt, and the changes were not reversible, and the knowledge that had animated it was too embodied, too personal, too dependent on the specific relationship of master and apprentice to survive the breaking of that relationship at scale. It went quietly, the way it had always wrecked without drama, without announcement, in the ordinary course of days that each seemed merely like the last, until enough of them had accumulated to constitute an ending. Fame is a peculiar and arbitrary thing. It attaches itself to certain lives, and not others according to criteria that have very little to do with the actual texture of a person's contribution to the world they inhabited. We remember the generals and the presidents, the inventors whose names became attached to their inventions, the writers whose sentences survived them, the painters whose canvases ended up in the right collections at the right moments. We remember the people who were remembered by other people who had the means and the inclination to do the remembering, who wrote letters that were kept, who sat for portraits that were preserved, whose stories were considered worth the effort of transmission across generations. The craftsmen who made the objects of daily life were rarely those people. They worked with their hands rather than their pens. They left their marks on metal rather than on paper, and the metal, being useful rather than decorative, was used, handled and washed and dented and repaired and eventually melted down and remade rather than carefully preserved. That so many of their names survive at all is something close to a miracle of historical accident. That so few people know those names is simply the ordinary condition of a world that has always paid more attention to power than to craft. Henry Will made pewter in New York for the better part of 4 decades, across a period that encompassed some of the most turbulent years in American history, and the fact that his name is not taught in schools alongside the names of the politicians and soldiers who occupied the foreground of those same years is not a reflection of his importance to the people among whom he lived and wreaked. It is simply a reflection of the kind of importance he had. The kind that is distributed across thousands of ordinary days rather than concentrated into a single dramatic moment. The kind that accumulates in objects rather than in documents. The kind that expresses itself through the patient satisfaction of work well done rather than through the legible ambition of public life. Will was born in Germany, probably in the 1720s, and came to New York as a young man already trained in the pewterer's trade. The German pewtering tradition from which he came was in some respects even more refined than the English tradition that dominated most of colonial American practice, and Will brought with him a sensibility and a technical vocabulary that gave his work a character subtly distinct from that of his contemporaries. He set up his workshop in New York and worked there through the colonial period, through the Revolution, a complicated time for a craftsman of German origin in a city that was occupied by British forces for most of the war, and into the early decades of the new republic. He had sons who followed him into the trade, and a brother, William Will, who established his own distinguished workshop in Philadelphia, so that the Will name appears across a remarkable range of surviving American pewter, pressed into metal in workshops separated by 100 miles and connected by blood and training in the shared inheritance of a craft carried across an ocean. The pieces that bear Henry Will's touchmark, connected Ocean. The pieces that bear Henry Will's touchmark, a small stamp with his name and the word New York, the precise design varying across the decades of his practice as his marks evolved, are among the most sought-after objects in the world of American pewter collecting today. They are sought not primarily because they are rare, though fine examples in good condition are not common, but because they represent some imaging that collectors and curators have learned to recognize as a specific quality of making, a consistency of proportion, a refinement of surface, a carefulness in the relationship between form and function, that speaks of a craftsman who cared deeply about the standard of his work and maintained that standard across a long career. You can see it in the way a Will plate sits, the slight curve of the rim, the evenness of the gauge across the whole surface, the particular quality of the bouge, that curved transition between the rim and the well of the plate, which in lesser hands could look uncertain, and in Will's hands always looked exactly as it should. These are small things. They are the kinds of things that only become visible when you have looked at enough pewter to know what variation looks like, but they are the signature of a man who knew what excellence required and went to the trouble of achieving it every day. Across 40 years of working mornings and afternoons in a workshop in New York, Thomas Danforth presents a different but equally instructive case in the archaeology of forgotten importance. The Danforth name is not one name, but a dynasty, a family of pewterers whose influence on American pewter making extended across 5 generations and more than a century, beginning with Thomas Danforth I, who was working in Taunton, Massachusetts in the 1720s and continuing through his sons and grandsons and great-grandsons into the mid-19th century. The sheer temporal span of the Danforth pewtering tradition is remarkable enough to maintain a family craft across 5 generations, transmitting the knowledge and the practice, and apparently the commitment from father to son across more than 100 years, is an achievement that most craft traditions never approach. But the geographic spread is equally striking. The Danforths worked in Connecticut, in Taunton and Norwich and Middletown, and various other towns, and their influence radiated outward from there across the whole of New England and beyond, through the apprentices they trained and the patterns they established and the market they helped define for quality American pewter. Thomas Danforth II, working in Middletown, Connecticut in the second half of the 18th century, is the member of the family whose work is most consistently identified by collectors as representing the tradition at its height. His plates and basins and porringers have a quality of assurance about them, a sense that the craftsman making them had so thoroughly internalized the standards of his trade that good work had become not an aspiration but simply what making meant. To hold a Danforth basin and feel its weight, to look at the surface and see how the light moves across it, to examine the turned foot rim and find it true, and finished with a care that no one would have required, or perhaps even noticed, is to encounter a particular kind of human excellence that has nothing to do with genius or inspiration, and everything to do with the disciplined application of skill across years of patient practice. It is the excellence of mastery, which is quieter and less dramatic than the excellence of talent, but in its own way more profound, because it is earned rather than given and maintained rather than discovered. Frederick Bassett worked in New York, like Henry Will, and the two men were contemporaries, whose careers overlapped for many years in the same city and presumably the same market. The existence of two craftsmen of high quality working in the same trade in the same place at the same time raises questions about competition and relationship that the historical record does not fully answer. We know from surviving documents that the community of colonial crafts, and in a city like New York, was small enough that its members knew one another, dealt with one another, sometimes served together on civic committees, or worshipped in the same churches. Whether Will and Bassett were rivals or collegial neighbors or something more complex than either of those categories, whether they exchanged technical knowledge or guarded it carefully, whether they competed for the same customers or served different segments of the market, we cannot say with certainty. What we can say is that the work each of them left behind is distinctive enough to be distinguished by a trained eye, which means that whatever their relationship, they were not simply copying one another, but developing individual approaches within the shared conventions of their trade. Bassett's touch marks, pressed into surviving pieces, are the closest thing we have to a direct record of his presence in the world. The marks changed over the course of his career, as craftsmen's marks often did, sometimes because a craftsman wished to signal a change in his work or his circumstances, sometimes simply because the original stamp wore out and a new one was cut. Reading the sequence of a craftsman's marks, where enough pieces survive to make the sequence visible, is like reading a compressed autobiography. The early mark, perhaps slightly uncertain in its cutting, the mature mark with its confident lines, the later mark that may show subtle changes in the lettering or the overall design. Bassett's marks place him in New York across a long working life that stretched from before the Revolution into the early 19th century, a span of practice that makes him one of the longer-lived presences in the documentary record of American pewter. Beyond these three names, Will Danforth Bassett, the catalog of colonial and early Republican pewterers extends into dozens of craftsmen whose work survives in museum collections and private hands, each name representing a life of making that has been almost entirely erased from the general cultural memory. Johann Christopher Hayne worked in Lancaster, Pennsylvania. Bringing a distinctly Germanic aesthetic to his work that makes his pieces immediately recognizable to those who have learned to look broader in form than the New England tradition, with a weightiness that reflects both the German pewtering heritage from which he came and the particular character of the Pennsylvania German community he served. His pieces are among the most visually striking in all of American pewter, possessing a kind of monumental calm that the sleeker New England forms do not quite achieve. William Will, Henry's brother in Philadelphia, produced a body of work whose range and ambition exceeded almost any other American pewterer of his generation, where many of his contemporaries concentrated on the standard domestic forms, plates, basins, spoons, tankards. Will extended his practice into more elaborate and technically demanding pieces. Tall coffee pots with complex profiles, ecclesiastical flagons for church use, teapots that reflected the fashionable forms of English silver without simply copying them. The survival rate of his work is higher than for many of his contemporaries, partly because the more elaborate pieces were less likely to be returned to the crucible when their useful life was over, and partly because Philadelphia, as the cultural capital of early Republican America, was a place where objects of quality had a better than average chance of being preserved rather than discarded. His touch marks, several different versions survive, pressed into pieces across a long career, are among the most reliably identified in the entire corpus of American pewter. The Boardman family of Connecticut represents another tie of multi-generational pewtering practice, straddling the period between the old handcraft tradition and the emerging era of mechanized production, with a pragmatism that speaks to the hard commercial realities of the early 19th century. The Boardmans adopted new methods when new methods were available. expanded their operation to a scale that earlier craftsmen would not have recognized as a pewter workshop, and in doing so extended the life of their enterprise beyond the point at which most of their contemporaries had ceased to operate. Whether this adaptation represented a betrayal of craft values or simply the intelligent response of practical businessmen to changing conditions is a question that admits of no clean answer. What is clear is that the Boardman marks appear on a larger volume of surviving American pewter than almost any other family name, which means that their work, whatever its relationship to the older handcraft tradition, was present in American households across a wide geographic range and a long span of time. What unites all of these names, Will and Danforth and Bassett and Hayne and Boardman, and the dozens of others who appear in the records of colonial and early Republican American pewter, is the particular form of anonymity that skilled craftsmen have always inhabited. They were known in their own time, known well, known in the specific and personal way that a community knows the people it depends on. For the objects of daily life, their customers knew their names, knew their workshops, knew from experience whether their work was reliable and their prices fair. They occupied a definite and respected position in the social fabric of their communities, but the kinds of knowing that crossed generations, the biographical record, the personal papers, the portraits, and the published appreciations and the commemorative addresses were not extended to them because they were craftsmen rather than public figures, makers rather than writers, people whose significance was expressed in metal rather than in language. The touchmark was both the solution to this problem and its emblem. A craftsman who could not leave a written record of his presence left instead a physical one, a small stamp pressed into the underside of every piece he made, linking the object permanently to its maker. As long as the object survived, the mark survived with it, carrying the craftsman's name forward through time in the only medium that could reliably hold it. That these marks are now studied by collectors and cataloged by museum curators, that entire reference books have been compiled, mapping the touch marks of American pewterers to the craftsmen who made them and the periods in which they worked. This is a form of posthumous recognition that the craftsmen themselves could not have anticipated, but that would perhaps not have surprised them. They understood in the practical way of people who work with durable materials that objects outlast their makers. They understood that the mark was a form of signature, a claim on the future. What they could not have known was how long the future would be, or how thoroughly the world in which their names had been common knowledge would dissolve, leaving only the mark on the metal to insist that they had been here, had worked here, had made things of value in these quiet workshops for these ordinary days that turned out, in the long view, to be the substance of history itself. To speak their names now, Will, Danforth, Bassett, Hayne, and all the others, is a small act of restoration, not of the workshops which are gone, or of the trade which is gone, or of the world that needed what they made, which is gone, but of the fact of their presence in that world, the fact that they got up in the morning and went to their workshops and lit their furnaces and poured their metal and scraped and burnished and finished and marked piece after piece across the long working years of their lives, and that this work mattered, and that the mattering does not require fame to be real. Pick up a colonial pewter plate, and the first thing you notice is the weight. Not the weight of precious metal, not the dramatic density of gold or the cool authority of solid silver, but something more modest and more surprising than either of those. A weight that seems slightly more than the object's appearance prepared you for. What is decidedly more than the object's appearance prepared you for? A gentle excess of substance that registers in the wrists and the palms as something between reassurance and intimacy. You were expecting something lighter, something more like the tin plate objects that succeeded pewter in the American household, and instead you are holding something that pushes back against your hands with a quiet insistence, that occupies space in a way that feels considered rather than accidental. That weight is the first thing the object tells you. It tells you that it was made from real material, in real quantity, by someone who understood that an object meant to be used every day needed enough substance to survive every day, enough mass to resist the ordinary accidents of a life conducted without the protections that modern manufacturing takes for granted. The second thing you notice, if you are paying attention, is the temperature. Pewter conducts heat differently from the ceramics and plastics that surround us now, differently even from the stainless steel that has taken over so many of the functions. Pewter once performed. It warms to the hand more readily than ceramic, holds that warmth longer than thinner metals, reaches a kind of equilibrium with the body that makes it feel, after a few moments of handling, less like an object, einheld and more like an extension of the hand itself. This quality, the way pewter mediates between the temperature of the body and the temperature of the room, finding a middle ground that feels neither cold nor artificially warm. Finding a middle ground that feels neither cold nor artificially warm was one of the reasons it was valued for drinking vessels in an age when the temperature of beverages mattered in ways we have largely forgotten. A pewter tankard held cider or ale at a temperature that was responsive to its environment, cooling in summer and holding warmth from a hearth side in winter in a way that ceramic could not quite replicate. The object was alive to its context. It participated in the conditions of its use, rather than simply enduring them. These are not the observations that appear in most museum labels, which tend toward the historical and the technical, the date, the maker's mark, the alloy composition, the provenance where it is known. Museum labels do their necessary work of situating objects in time and place, and within the web of human activity that produced them, but they cannot fully convey what it means to hold one of these pieces, because that meaning is not primarily cognitive, it is somatic, felt in the body before it is understood by the mind, registered in the hands and the wrists and the forearms before it resolves into anything that language can adequately describe. The collectors who have devoted their lives to finding and preserving American pewter understand this. They will tell you, if you ask them how they came to the subject, about a moment of handling, a piece encountered at an estate sale or in a dealer's back room, picked up almost casually, and then not put down. The object arrested them. It made a claim on their attention that they had not anticipated and could not entirely explain, and they have spent years, sometimes decades, trying to understand what that claim consisted of. Of what they are responding to, though they may not always articulate it in these terms, is the presence of a specific human life in the object, not metaphorically, but in a real and traceable sense. A colonial pewter plate was touched by its maker hundreds of times during the process of its creation, during the casting, the scraping, the turning on the lathe, the burnishing, the final inspection, before it was considered finished. The surface of the plate bears, in its microscopic topography, the record of those touches, the paths of the scraping tool, the overlapping strokes of the burnisher, the slight variations in pressure and angle that no two hands would produce in exactly the same way. These marks are below the threshold of ordinary visual perception, invisible to the casual glance, but they are present in the surface, in the same way that a fingerprint is present, encoding the specificity of a particular person, working in a particular way, at a particular moment. Modern scientific analysis can sometimes make them visible, can distinguish through careful examination of tool marks the work of one craftsman from another even when no touch mark is present to confirm the attribution. The person who made the object is still in it. They have not gone away. They are simply waiting to be read by someone with the patience and the knowledge to do the reading. The touch marks themselves are perhaps the most direct form of this presence. The maker's deliberate inscription of himself into the object, the small stamp pressed into the metal that says, with a clarity that no other form of documentation quite matches, "I was here, I made this, this is mine." Collectors who specialize in American pewter develop an intimate familiarity with these marks, learning to distinguish the subtly different versions of a craftsman's stamp across the decades of his career, to identify marks of obscure regional makers who appear in no reference book, and are known only through the surviving pieces that bear their impressions. This work of identification is part detective story and part portraiture, building up, from the physical evidence of the marks themselves, a picture of people who left no other record of their existence, a mark that has never been documented before, found on a piece of pewter purchased at a country auction, represents not just an interesting puzzle for the collector, but a genuine historical discovery, the recovery of a name, and through the name a life, that was otherwise entirely lost. The pieces themselves, considered as a body of surviving material, tell a story about American life in the colonial and early Republican periods that is different from the story told by the documentary record, and in some ways more intimate, more granular, more revealing of the texture of ordinary existence. The distribution of forms among surviving pieces reflects the actual priorities of colonial households with a directness that written inventories can gesture toward but not fully convey. Plates survive in large numbers because plates were the most universally necessary domestic object and were made in correspondingly large quantities. Spoons survive, though more rarely, because spoons were small and easily lost, and often returned to the crucible when they wore out. Porringers survive in remarkable variety. Their handles, cast separately from the bowl and attached, or cast integrally in more ambitious pieces, displaying a range of decorative designs that speaks to the value colonial makers and buyers placed on even modest aesthetic elaboration in everyday objects. Tankards tell a particular story about the social life of the colonial period, about the centrality of communal drinking, the tavern as a primary site of public life, the role of alcohol in lubricating the social machinery of communities that had few other venues for the kind of informal gathering that binds a society together. A surviving colonial pewter tankard is a social object in a way that a plate is not quite. A plate feeds one person at a time, even when it is part of a table setting for many. A tankard circulates, is passed around the table, refilled from a common source, shared among people whose names we do not know in rooms whose walls no longer stand. To hold a tankard is to hold an object that has been held by many hands across many occasions, an object whose use was inherently collective, in ways that the individualism of our current material culture makes difficult to fully imagine. The ecclesiastical pieces, the flagons and chalices and communion plates made for church use, occupy a different position in the emotional register of pewter collecting. They are among the most carefully preserved, surviving examples of the craft, having been maintained by institutions rather than individuals, and therefore spared the attrition of domestic use and the periodic returns to the crucible that wore away so much secular pewter. Church pewter was polished and stored and polished again across generations, kept in conditions that preserved its surface and its form, with a fidelity that no household object could match. The finest of these pieces, made by craftsmen like William Will for Philadelphia congregations, or by the Connecticut Danforth for New England churches, have a gravity about them that is not entirely explainable by their alloy, or their form, or their surface quality. They have been held in the context of human mortality and human hope for so long that something of that context seems to have accumulated in them, a seriousness that is felt even by people who have no particular religious feeling and no special knowledge of objects' history. Museum curators who work with collections of American pewter often describe a phenomenon that their professional training does not entirely prepare them for: the sense, when handling significant pieces, of a connection across time that is more than merely intellectual. This is not mysticism, or not primarily mysticism. It is the recognition that these objects were made with the same hands, the same basic anatomy of fingers and palms and wrists, that are now holding them. That the human body has not changed in the interval, even as everything surrounding it has changed beyond recognition. A pewter plate made in 1742 was held by hands that had the same structure as the hands holding it now. The weight registered in the same muscles, the warmth transferred through the same skin. There is a continuity in this that bypasses the usual mechanisms of historical understanding, the documents and the dates and the contextual frameworks, and goes straight to something more immediate, more physical, more difficult to argue with than any interpretation. The date 1742 is worth pausing on, because it is not merely a label, it is a coordinate in time that, when you hold a piece made in that year, connects you to a specific set of human circumstances that are both impossibly remote and strangely close. In 1742, the 13 colonies that would become the United States were still British possessions, their relationship with the mother country strained but not yet broken. The people who ate from the plate whose weight you are now feeling in your hands were subjects of George II living in a world lit by candles and heated by wood fires, in which news traveled at the speed of a horse, and the fastest journey between Boston and Philadelphia took the better part of a week. They had never seen an electric light or heard a recorded sound, or traveled faster than a gallop in horse. Their medical understanding was such that infections we treat casually now killed people regularly, and without much that could be done about it. Their relationship with time was different from ours, slower, more seasonal, more governed by the rhythms of natural light and agricultural necessity than by the artificial schedules that organize our days. And yet the meal eaten from this plate was a meal, food prepared by human hands and consumed by a human body that was hungry, and then, after the meal, no longer hungry. The conversation around the table was conversation, people talking about the things that mattered to them, their worries and their pleasures, their news and their opinions, and their small daily observations about the world they were living in. The children at the table were children, noisy and restless and requiring management, exactly as children have always been and will always be. The pewter plate sat in the middle of all this life and received it, received the food and the hands and the ordinary attention and inattention of people who were entirely absorbed in being alive and had no reason to think that the plate would survive them by centuries and come to stand. The plate would survive them by centuries and come to stand in the hands of someone impossibly distant from them in time as a kind of messenger. That it does stand as a messenger is one of the things that makes material history, the history told through surviving objects rather than surviving documents, so different in its emotional register from conventional historical narrative. Documents tell us what people thought and said and decided. Objects tell us what people made and used and cared for. The difference is significant. Thought and speech and decision are the surface of a life. The parts that are conscious and intentional and directed outward toward the world, making and using and caring, are something closer to the interior, daily practice of a life, the texture of ordinary hours, the relationship between a person and the material world that surrounds and sustains them. When we encounter a well-made piece of colonial pewter, we are encountering someone's relationship with the material world, their willingness to make something carefully, to finish it to a standard, to mark it with their name, and send it out into the daily life of their community as a reliable and honest object. We are encountering, in other words, a form of integrity. Not moral integrity in the abstract sense, but practical integrity in the most literal sense. The quality of being whole, of holding together, of being what it appears to be. Pewter endures not because it is precious. The great irony of its survival is that it endured partly because it was not precious enough to be melted down for its monetary value the way silver so often was. Silver followed the price of silver, was converted into coin or sold by weight when financial pressure demanded it, its form sacrificed to its material value. Pewter, cheaper and less liquid as an asset, was more likely to be simply kept, stored in attics and cellars and the backs of cupboards when it went out of fashion, surviving through the long decades of its cultural invisibility until collectors and curators rediscovered it and gave it a new kind of value, not monetary but historical. It endured because it was overlooked. It endured because someone in a farmhouse in Connecticut or a townhouse in Philadelphia decided that the bother of melting it down was not worth the small return and pushed it to the back of a shelf and forgot about it, and in forgetting about it, preserved it. But it endured also, and more fundamentally because someone cared enough to make it well. The craftsmanship that went into the best colonial pewter, the evenness of the gauge, the truth of the form, the quality of the surface, was not required by the market. Customers could not always tell the difference between careful work and careless work, especially once the piece had been in use for a few years, and its surface had acquired the gentle patina of handling. The extra care that a craftsman like Henry Will or Thomas Danforth brought to his work was not commercially mandated. It was a choice, the choice to do the thing properly, to hold oneself to a standard that exceeded what was strictly necessary, to make something that deserved to last rather than merely something that would serve for a while. That choice is present in the surviving pieces in a way that is almost palpable. It is what the collector feels when she picks up a piece and knows immediately, before she has examined the mark or assessed the condition that this is good work. The care that went into the making is still in the object. It has not diminished with time. If anything, it is more visible now than it was when the piece was new. Visible in a way that all genuine quality becomes more visible as the merely adequate falls away, and what remains is what was worth keeping. What survives them is not just metal, it is attention. It is the accumulated hours of a craftsman's working life, compressed into an object small enough to hold in two hands, durable enough to have crossed 3 centuries without ceasing to be itself. To hold it is to receive a kind of message that was never consciously sent. A message about what it means to make something with care, to put your name on your work, to send it out into the world as an honest representation of what you knew and what you could do. The craftsman who made it is gone. The world he made it in is gone. The meal it was made to serve was eaten long ago by people whose names are mostly lost. But the plate is here. The weight of it is here, and in that weight, if you are willing to be still enough to feel it, is everything that the history books cannot quite hold. The actual substance of a life pressed into soft metal by patient hands, surviving against all reasonable expectation into this present moment, still warm from the last pair of hands that held it, waiting quietly for the next. And so the workshops fell silent for the last time, not with drama, not with ceremony, but simply because the world moved on, the way it always does. Sleep well. The past will still be here tomorrow.